Good morning, Mr.
Morning.
Chair, members. Thank you for having me here to speak to you today about progress on the world's best workforce and share a little bit about where we're at and a little bit about the legislation as a reminder. We have a short PowerPoint for you today to just bring you through where we're at with the world's best workforce and then present some data. We do have other data that we will provide to you through the web because they're Excel files. There's a lot of data, and we just want to make sure that you have those links because it would have been a lot of paper we would have had to bring with us today to be able to have all of that, but we'll make sure that we have that provided to you. So I first want to start by thanking Stephanie Graff, who you see right here by me, and Deputy Commissioner Steve Dibb. When this law passed in 2013, we spent quite a bit of time unpacking the new law, going around the state and talking with superintendents and stakeholder groups about World's Best Workforce, what it meant, and really it was a new accountability system and a new strategic planning process for many of our school superintendents and school districts. And they began to unpack it themselves and work with their community, work with their teachers, their principals, and their school boards to be able to look at alignment of resources, alignment of strategies, and focus on 5 key goals. So those key goals were getting every child ready for kindergarten. And many of you know not all our schools do have preschool. I know we've been working toward getting more of our 4-year-olds into preschool, but we still felt it important to have preschool and kindergarten readiness as a goal for school districts to work with the local providers, Head Start, local home providers, child care centers, to start looking at what is the learning progression around our standards. Then to have 3rd graders proficient in reading. As you know, we did extensive work in the 2011 session around Read Well by 3rd grade and continue to work toward providing assurances that students are reading well at 3rd grade. Then, of course, all students are high school completers, and getting that diploma and being career and college ready is a huge piece for us. So you have high school graduation separate and career and college readiness. One thing to note here is that under No Child Left Behind and under our No Child Left Behind waiver, and now under the new Elementary Secondary Education Act, now called Every Student Succeeds Act, which was just passed in December, only schools that received federal Title I funding were under that accountability system, that federal accountability system. And even though we aligned some of our state statutes to our federal accountability system, the World's Best Workforce includes all Minnesota schools. So we have approximately 850 or so schools that receive Title I, but under World's Best Workforce, 2,000 schools are held accountable under the World's Best Workforce legislation. Why this is so important is as we strive to address the disparities of all students, certainly you can see how having 50% of our schools, more than 50% of our schools, not having to share in the accountability for those students could make a significant difference to whether those students are actually counted. So we believed when we were passing this legislation in 2013 that this was a way to include more schools and to include more students so that we could more aggressively meet our goals around closing of these achievement gaps. So the process is that school boards would adopt a comprehensive long-term strategic plan to support teaching and learning. That plan is moving forward. They do not have to submit that plan to the department. However, they do have to publish an annual report. They have to have an annual public meeting, and they have to have in there the diversity of the district within this public meeting. Parents need to be included. All of the organizations in their district should be included. And then they have to develop a brief summary to the department each year in an annual report, and then we report back to you. And that should reflect on their previous year. And we, this year, have streamlined the process for school districts to make it easier for us to be able to provide better better quality feedback to our school districts. And so included in your packets is also a template and a rubric that we provided to districts so that they would understand how we would be providing the feedback up front, and also a template so that they knew that this was fill in the blank, briefly describe, so that it was not burdensome or difficult for them to do. We received a lot of feedback from superintendents this year, sharing with us that this was a much better process for them and easier to follow. So some of the outreach I mentioned already, but I want to just remind you that we did have ongoing outreach. Stephanie does most of that outreach for our school districts. As you know, all superintendents have my personal cell phone number, so they're able to get hold of me if they need me on any occasion. I get back to superintendents usually within a couple hours if they have a question. Regional superintendent meetings were held October of 13 through February of 14. We had over 800 participants. We've presented to the School Boards Association, the Rural Association, secondary school principals, AMSD, summer superintendent conferences, at our Title I conferences. We've just really been trying to saturate as much as we could to make sure that everybody had the information they needed to have really strong, cohesive, and coherent strategic plans under the World's Best Workforce. There's been hundreds of one-to-one technical assistance to districts and phone calls to Stephanie and myself and Steve to answer questions from school board members, to answer questions from the public, or from teachers and principals and school superintendents. I went to the road, took the road this past year with the summaries to really talk to superintendents about their responsibilities under the World's Best Workforce, and for the first time to present some data underneath the goals, and we'll share that with you in just a few moments. I presented this data as regional data, as well as gave them their own district data. So they not only saw their school district's data, I shared with them how all the other districts within their region are doing, as well as put that onto our webpage so that they could see not only their region, but they could see all the other regions as well. The reason this is so important that we have this kind of transparency is so that we can identify where things are working, and then we can share that best practice, not only across our hallways and schools, but across entire districts. Because if we systemically want to change education in Minnesota and address the gaps, we need more schools, more kids, more teachers collaborating together, so that then those best practices are shared across the entire state systemically, rather than having a pocket of success here or there. We've also had multiple legislative hearings where we've reported on the progress of World's Best Workforce and on achievement gap closure and other measures. So last year, districts didn't use the standard format, as I said, and I've included those in your packet. We have had more meaningful feedback. We've just finished that review. We had how many people, Stephanie, at the state? We had 48, nearly 50 people at the agency who kind of dropped everything to read these, review them. They had significant training so that we could have inter-rater reliability on these as we provided better feedback to school districts. Because as you know, this was 3 years out for the World's Best Workforce, that they had to make their goals, implement their strategies, and then report out yearly to the commissioner on their progress. And so we wanted to be sure that our processes were as tight as possible to be able to give as good of information as we possibly could, so that they knew exactly where they stood, because next year is where the rubber kind of hits the road. It's where we will then determine whether they are making sufficient progress toward the goals that they have set as a community and as a school district, and then determine what is needed for them to even more aggressively meet their goals if they should not have met their goals with this 2% potential set aside to more aggressively meet their goals, and we'll discuss that a little bit further into the presentation. So this feedback is going to be sent to school districts pretty soon here, and we're going to get it out next couple of weeks. the next couple of weeks, so that they'll have that and be able to do their planning and budgeting for the next school year. And hopefully, as you know, our two biggest goals in the state under our waiver were to have a 90% graduation rate for all students, no student group being below 85% in graduation rates, and also to close achievement gaps as measured on the MCAs by 50%. So those were very aggressive goals under our waiver. We're showing progress toward those goals, but we still have a lot more work yet to do. So districts have the flexibility to establish their world's best workforce goals and benchmarks using local measures, and they track their progress regularly on these local measures. What we found in our review is that the quality and rigor of those local goals are still maturing. We've asked them to do SMART goals, which are specific, they're strategic, measurable, they're attainable, they're results-based, and they are linked to time-based and deadlines. So that's what we consider a SMART goal. And so some districts are very well matured and have been doing this for years, and some districts are very new at this. That's just really clear in the review. And even some districts use the rubric, and we can tell that there are other districts that did not use the rubric. So we are still yet providing training, we are still yet maturing the system around strategic planning, around resource alignment and strategic alignment to those resources, because once that happens and it coalesces, you're just much more intentional and deliberate about your efforts around those 5 goals. So I gave you some samples of some of the goals. So they go all the way from folks saying, let's increase the participation in our ECFE programs to increase some of the kindergarten readiness, as to some districts have full-out kindergarten assessments that they use. And maybe they're using the work study or they're using the FAST or something like that. And they can have very measurable goals. And it's not just a participation goal, but it's an actual achievement goal that they have done. Around gap closure, there's some that are using, grade point average, and there's some that are using MCAs. So as you can tell, this is good for local school districts to determine their goals, but if the legislature's intent was for us to come and report back to you their progress toward those goals, you have over 2,000 schools, 325 districts, and 145 charters. It would be very hard to aggregate that up to a state level because they aren't all the same indicators and same measurable goals. I already said the planning was still maturing. Also, the goal setting, I think, is still maturing. And so that's very challenging for us to try to summarize and aggregate them up to a much larger kind of overall picture. So what we've done is really kind of use our federal waiver as our guide and the measurable tools that we actually do have to measure up some data for you and kind of give you some idea. But this is not, it's not apples to apples. So I just want to be very clear that under World's Best Workforce, local school boards have the opportunity to set their own measures. Those are different than what I'll present to you today, because it's impossible for us to aggregate up 2,325 different school districts' measurable goals. So this sheet is just a sheet that gives you where you can find this information. And this is the information that I've presented to the superintendents when I went out to their regional meetings. And so looking at all students ready, we have a menu of valid and reliable tools that we are now starting to put under our KEP, our kindergarten entry profile. And there's 4 different assessments that we'll be using that will bubble up to an overall assessment. We do need funding to be able to build that system, but we are trying to work with superintendents and kindergarten teachers to start training on these 4 assessments. All students in 3rd grade achieving grade level, we're looking at both proficiency and growth from 3rd to 4th grade growth scores, and we presented that information to superintendents. closing of achievement gaps. Every single school in the state under our waiver is given an achievement gap measure. And so we look at those, but this measure is whether we're looking at did they or did they not meet their annual measurable outcome and goal. And that's based on proficiency. Did they or did they not meet their proficiency target under the federal waiver? And then we presented information on 8th grade math because that's the best indicator we have of college and career readiness at this point, given we don't have a law that requires the ACT any longer, so we don't have that as a requirement. Some districts are using that as a measure of career and college readiness, but for what we've given out, the best correlation we have for that and the best information we have is around 8th grade math proficiency. And then all students graduating, and did they graduate? And I want to remind folks that we have this 90% goal by 2020 for all kids, but we also have a goal for every student group not to be below 85%. And that's at both the district and the school level that they got this information. And again, they got all schools in the state. So we sent that to principals and superintendents so our high school principals could see how all the other high schools were doing in the state. Very easily on an Excel, they could sort it by region and by their area. So we wanted to make sure that they had all that information, that the data was very transparent. So how are we doing? So if you look at math achievement has been very stagnant since we've had the new math test in 2011. As you know, we passed new math standards in 2007. And we have very rigorous math standards up to Algebra 2 in high school, as well as requiring every 8th grader to master Algebra 1. And that's a graduation requirement now as of our class of 2015. So it's the first time kids have been held to that graduation standard. And so it's a very high standard. And so what we did this year was create a math toolkit. I don't have that on here, but I just wanted to let you know. I had my team of math specialists work with our assessment division to look at where were kids getting questions wrong. What was the level of difficulty of those benchmarks? And what were they struggling with? And so we sent that out a couple months ago to our superintendents and to our curriculum folks so that they could better manage their scope and sequence of their instruction and of their content so that the more difficult items that most districts were getting wrong, they could then plan for earlier so that they could reteach those concepts. So fingers crossed, most districts are using this math toolkit. What I hear from out in the field when I go out is, wow, this is great. Can we have it for literacy too? We're working on our literacy toolkit so that we can look at what are those more difficult items. As you know, even for literacy, our Lexile range is much more difficult. They're reading nonfiction now and informational text, which is also a shift. So as we've shifted to higher and more rigorous standards, our assessments are also more rigorous and difficult, and our cut scores are higher. You can see the dip that happened when we gave those new tests, and the recovery is much slower.
Senator Bonoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioner. Going back first to the saying that you're using the grade 8 math to determine all students' career and college ready. Why not the MCAs? I understand why not the ACTs, but why wouldn't the MCAs be utilized to determine whether or not students were college and career ready?
Senator Bonoff, Mr. Chair, it is the MCA, so it's the 8th grade MCA.
And that's the last?
No, they also take the 11th grade MCA.
Right. So it still seems early to be making that determination with the 8th grade.
Yeah. We could use the 11th grade MCA too here as well. These are not in stone
Gotcha.
Type of measures. This is, just information we're giving because we have correlated 8th grade MCAs to, I think it's in our Getting Ready report, to whether they have to take remedial education or not in college and career ready.
And then if you go back to the districts meeting achievement gap targets, that's very confusing.
Yep.
If you could just explain why the district count meeting targets for our white kids is 104 districts missing 323 at a 24%.
Yep.
meeting target compared to the higher percents meeting target in the other subgroups. Could you go into more detail?
Yep, so Mr. Chair, Senator Bonif, I actually haven't gotten to the achievement gap yet. I was just talking about proficiency overall. But let's go to the slide then on achievement gap. So on achievement gap, what you see is, let's just take American Indian since I pulled that out here. So for American Indian, and let me just qualify this, these are district counts.
Right.
Not school counts. Yeah. So our numbers look better school to school because you can imagine like a district like Minneapolis that has multiple schools, the whole district wouldn't make it, but they have schools that are making certain targets. So, so our district count meeting for American Indian out of the overall, all districts and public charters is 50 for American Indian students, and 35 are missing targets. Now remember, you see 85 are the district total, and you go, well, what about all the rest of the districts? They don't have 20 students in their cell size in order to count toward this accountability measure, right? So you have to have at least 20, right, in the accountability measure to be able to count for this. And this is including all schools, all districts. And so that's about 59% who are meeting their targets. Now, if you go and look at white students, you have a lot more white students in Minnesota. So you have a lot more school districts not meeting their target for white students because let's say the overall proficiency for white students in third grade reading, for instance, is about 60%. Well, 60% of white students are not meeting. Well, we still wanted them to close their achievement gap by half to 100. So they would then, from 2012 when we got our waiver to 2017, have to close that by 50%, which is about 20 percentage points. So we'd still expect them to have growth each year. Well, what we're seeing is that they're not growing each year toward their target.
Okay.
So, and that's in more schools than not, that our white students are not growing in their targets, but yet they're able to identify the kids of color or their poor kids and target resources there. But there are a number of districts that are not getting the growth out of their white students and getting them to grow faster, because the whole theory behind this is that all boats rise, white students do well, but we need our kids of color and our underrepresented kids and our poor kids who have traditionally done poor to go faster. And we're seeing that with our graduation rates. Everybody's going up with graduation rates, and we're seeing our kids of color going up faster and our poor kids and our EL kids, but we're not seeing that with our math and reading proficiency.
Thank you.
Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Clausen brings up the R word, remediation or remedial, which I think is going to be something that I hear from him quite often, and it brings up a question, and I don't know if this is the right format to ask it, but on the MCA 2s, is there a correlation?
We're on the MCA 3 now.
Okay, so can we go back to maybe, the MCA 3s, maybe you can help me flesh this out. Is there a correlation between that test in grade 11 and then post-secondary success?
Mr. Chair, Senator Hoffman, I believe there is. I don't have the study right in front of me. I'd have to have Jennifer Dugan come and present that to you. And I don't have the Getting Ready report either, but I know that there's a section in the Getting Ready report that does look at math and its correlation. I'm just not sure exactly if it's 8th or 11th grade. I'd have to get Jennifer, so we'll get back to you on that question.
Mr. Chair, yeah, thank
wait,
you,
them
Commissioner.
both.
Maybe just email it to the committee
We'll
or
make sure
email
that
it
you
to
get
the committee administrator, and we
Yeah.
can get that. So thank you.
Yeah. So that's in math, and you can see where we're doing really well with our closing of achievement gaps for Asian students. Hispanic students, over half of our districts are meeting their targets. But the point here is that you see districts meeting their targets for the different student groups, but still having some significant difficulty with special ed students and white students. Reading is a similar picture. We have about 61% of districts who are meeting their reading targets for American Indian students, for instance, and 26% of districts meeting their reading targets for white students in closing achievement gaps. Now, remember, white students still do score proficient. Their proficiency is higher than all the other student groups, so that's where we have this disparity in the gap, but they're still expected to grow and to close their gap by 1/2. And what we're saying here is they're not meeting their targets to get on track by 2017 in order to meet that target for white students. And if you look at the other numbers, you can see most other student groups are meeting over 50% in reading, meeting their targets. So districts are moving toward, we've only been at this 2 years, and to have 50% meeting on a reading target is progress, but we need all our districts moving in this direction. And these numbers are much higher for our schools who are meeting rather than just districts, like I mentioned before. So then you can break this data out by region. So we look at the XQ regions, and there are 11 of them. And we have combined 1 and 2 here for ease, and 6 and 8 as well, because those are, the superintendents meet together in those 2 regions together. And so then when we combine it, we look at which part of the state is seeing the greatest proficiency rates for reading, for instance, 3rd grade reading. So if you go across and you look at American Indian students, for instance, you can see that Region 10 is, and Region 3 are 2 of the top performers for American Indian students. And I should have actually provided you a map on here. I'm thinking about it now, so you can see where these
It's a key that would tell us.
Oh, good. Right, I'm, oh, did you send it to them, Adosh, or? Let's send it again. We'll make sure you get that, so that you can see where these are in the state. And then, you know, you can see it's very similar, Region 3 and Region 10 outperforming the states with white students as well as Region 11. So this is useful data for the superintendents to kind of see where they're at, how they can work together as a region collectively to share best practices and to increase student achievement for all kids. And we break this out again by student group. Math, proficiency here on the data, you can see where you have Region 11 outperforming most other regions for white students, and also for our, let's see, if you look across. For instance, if you look at African American students, it's Regions 1 and 2 who are outperforming all other regions. So why this is significant is then I can go there and then I can drill down into the districts and look at the schools and look at their data and then say, okay, where are they getting results, and then share that. So graduation rates. Looking at 4-year graduation rates, there is a difference between this and 5-year and 6-year graduation rates, which are also used in our accountability system, but we typically report out 4-year graduation rates. You can see where graduation rates are for our students, and we will be releasing graduation rate data in the next couple of weeks here for the 2015 graduating class. So let me just briefly speak about Essa, and then I'll take your questions. So Every Student Succeeds Act was passed in December. And the reason I just want to speak to it here is because under World's Best Workforce, we were able to, like I said, include all schools. And under Essa, it requires us only to include title schools. But as you can see from the regional data, we are not there yet. We have more work to yet do to address disparities. We can't really afford to leave 50% of our schools behind because demographically, our kids are everywhere. Poor kids are everywhere. Kids who speak another language are everywhere. Kids of color are everywhere. And so they're in all our schools, and so every school really ought to be held accountable like they are for World's Best Workforce. What I think the Every Student Succeeds Act gives us the opportunity to do, and we are meeting with stakeholders over the next year. I've met with all of you. Thank you for coming. That was a wonderful meeting. We've had our initial intro meeting where we had over 100 people in attendance, maybe near 200. For that meeting of stakeholders to talk about ESSA and the process for approving our new accountability system under the federal accountability. Why I bring it up here is I think we have the opportunity to align World's Best Workforce and the federal accountability system because there's so much flexibility given to the state now under Every Student Succeeds Act in order to develop their own accountability system. But you still must include proficiency. You still must include measures of growth. Every student still must be tested grades 3 through 8 and once in high school in reading, math, and science. And high schools that fall below 67% graduation rate must be intervened with, as well as the bottom 5%, however the state determines that, need to be supported through a school improvement process for at least 3 to 4 years. Also, you have the opportunity, states have the opportunity, must include a third measure into that accountability system. So that can be a social emotional measure, that could be a student engagement connectedness measure, that could be a career and college ready measure, that could be an equity index measure like I discussed with you all at the first meeting. There could be a number of things that are used for that third measure. So that's a high-level kind of summary of Essa and how we could try to align the state and federal systems so that it could be more transparent to parents and community members, easier to understand, and one that really does get at the crux of Minnesota's Achilles heel, which is really addressing these disparities in a very strategic manner, which I think World's Best Workforce does, aligning all of our resources, both federal and state resources, to address these problems and to more aggressively go after improving student achievement. So what would be some of the recommendations I might make around bettering World's Best Workforce? One is I think we need some strong accountability to the goals. What will be those measures? Having them locally determined provides a challenge for us to aggregate up. So I think that that's a piece for discussion. Supporting more schools. If we are not supporting 835 under federal accountability, but now supporting 2,000, and the expectation is that the department will somehow collaborate or work with our regional centers, then that's going to provide, there's going to have to be double the capacity in order to do that, because we just will not have the capacity to support or to intervene in a meaningful way with those schools. So somehow we have to think about how we would support those schools. And then just what is the reporting measures that we want to have out for our superintendents, our school personnel, our educators, and our stakeholders around our website and our data center, and what kind of analytics do you all want as summaries for your work as you develop policies and allocate and appropriate resources out to our schools. So that's mostly what I have for you, and I'd be glad to entertain any questions or thoughts or comments on where we're at and how we can move forward.
Thank you, Commissioner and Ms. Graff, Deputy Dept. Senator Dahl, followed by Senator Torres-Ray and Senator Dames.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Stephanie, former student of mine, doing well. I know that these schools have to provide their plans and their SMART goals and such. At any point, besides how well they're doing in meeting those goals, do they have to provide you with any of their strategies or remediation or support types of strategies that they're using in the school? How does that information, if they are doing things that are really working for the particular districts, does that find its way then to the regional centers in terms of how they support the schools?
Yeah, So, Mr. Chair, Senator Dahl, great question. I think as we look at it moving forward, as we've collected these, they do not need to provide us their plan, but within the summary, we ask about strategies and goals. And then that's what we're giving them feedback on. And maybe we'll see that they're not meeting their goals, but then we'll see some disconnect in terms of their curriculum adoption or their implementation strategies, at what grade levels, and see that that's not being carried through, and it can be just simply we're providing them some feedback on review. So I think what we're going to see next year when kind of, I've said, the rubber hits the road, where we're really going to be looking at that accountability system kicking in 2017, we're going to have, because we'll have, 325 districts that we're providing feedback to and 145 charters, it will go to the scale of you're getting a letter stating you didn't meet your goals, but you have only met in, you're not meeting in one area, for instance. So it's not a very severe kind of case. And we'll say now, meet with your school board, meet with your constituents, have a hearing, and revise and turn back into your yearly summary your actions you're going to be taking to remediate this issue. That would be probably the simplest. The next one would be where we identify those schools for regional center support. And we say, we'd like you to collectively meet with our regional centers to address these issues and look at the 2% set aside, and then turn that in for whatever you're going to be doing in your yearly summary that you give in your corrective action plan, so to speak. To the most severe case, where I think I personally would be working with the school superintendent, talking with the school superintendent as they're designing plans, and having our team more deliberately and intentionally working with them around what that 2% ought to be spent on. And that would be like you're missing it on all your areas. You've been missing it for 3 years in a row. Maybe there's a brand-new superintendent in the district who needs that kind of undergirding and support. And then we would determine together what we would do to move forward.
Senator Torres-Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm on. Commissioner, thank you for this. I very much appreciate that we are moving in this direction and that we finally have in place a system to measure something that we've been talking about for the last 25 years. So I think that this is really a remarkable tool and effort to really do something that we needed to do. I'm curious about two things. One is, how do we get the list of the districts that are not reporting, that are not included in these reports that you are providing to us? I understand that St. Paul and Minneapolis are not reporting to you, but I'm not clear on how that works. And I think that it is important for us to know, because if some districts are reporting and some are not, we need to figure out, what do we do with those districts that do receive funding but do not report? And the second question that I have is, how do we actually learn kind of qualitative results? Because at the end, the quantitative data that you provide to us is very helpful, but we need to know, what are they doing? What are these districts and these schools doing in order to get to, those results? And whether or not you could really analyze some of those quantitative measures that are being utilized and the resources that are being attached to those qualitative measures in order to obtain, these numbers. So I wonder if you could help us understand those two issues.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Commissioner, in your response, if you could indicate, of the 2,000 schools and 340 or so charters, how many did not respond?
Mr. Chair, Senator Torres-Ray, we have about 12 who did not respond, districts, not schools, because this is a district-level accountability system. And so that's the number, and that should be in your report too. You should have them listed, which ones didn't. I must tell you that providing the template, I think, helped them to better meet the requirement to turn it in. But there was some phone calling I had to do to get folks to turn it in.
Ma'am.
As they've matured and kind of gotten used to the world's best workforce.
Commissioner, do you know how many schools that represents those 12 districts? And was St. Paul and Minneapolis?
No, St. Paul and Minneapolis turned in their summary. Yeah. But we'll see how many schools were represented under those 12. Some of them are all charter, who maybe are new to this process of accountability, and so we'll make sure that we get that to you. Your second question, Senator Torres-Ray, was about the qualitative review. And so we're collecting this data now, and it's a lot of data, so we're trying to understand better what is working and what are those inputs rather than just all the quantitative and output data. We are looking at what are those qualitative measures and sharing that with our regional centers. Our school support division was a large part of the reviewers, so they're reading them. Actually, having 48 MDE staff reading these gives us a better sense of where districts are at and the strategies that we're working on, so that we can then share that across all of the experts within our agency as well as with our regional centers who are working side by side with our schools. And so I think the best avenue of sharing this quality data is going to be through our regional centers. They're going to be the ones who house it because they're working with the cooperatives, and it's our cooperatives throughout Minnesota who are convening all of our school districts, personnel and educators together and talking about these topics. So I think that that's critical. I do want to share that I have been visiting our 30 four-time reward schools and our 14 five-time reward schools. And what I have found is that they all share similar qualities. And you can sense it when you go right in the door. The one thing that I would say almost all of them say is that they are actually a family. And they use that word, that they are a family, and that they don't let each other fail. And they don't let children fail. The second thing that they do, and that's about relationships. The second thing that they do is that they have really timely interventions. Either they're using our ADSES funding for RTI measures, or they are doing flexible grouping that changes, or they're doing co-teaching models. But they are doing these early interventions or push-in models with kids, for instance, EL. You know, they'll have push-in support for EL kids so that the general ed teacher and the EL teacher are working with the kids. And so it's interesting to hear them talk about these early interventions. The third thing that they do is almost all of them have a morning meeting. They're connecting with kids. They are reviewing data. They're checking in on the social emotional piece with kids regularly. And then the fourth thing is strong parent-community partnerships. I mean, these are schools that, whether they're big or small, have really strong external partnerships with the community coming in and working with the schools. The difficult thing about those four things that I said, it's not Charlotte Danielson's model of teacher evaluation. It's not Marzano's vocabulary across the curriculum. It's not any one special silver bullet or program. It's about the people in the school just coming together and deciding that they're going to get it done for kids. And so that is harder to scale than giving them a program. And then anything that they've done is implemented really well. They agree on a few things, and they implement them with really great fidelity. Every single teacher that I talk to, and when I do these roundtables, there's, anywhere from 5 to 15 teachers talking to me. They're all singing from the same song sheet. And so I think that that's what makes it so special, and that's why they're getting these sustained results every year. So we need more schools like that. So how do you get more schools like that? You get everyone into these schools so that they can see that this is possible and this can actually happen. In traditional schools and in charter schools, it didn't matter if it was small or big. It was just about great teachers doing great things for kids and not letting them fail, and not letting each other fail.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for being here this morning and doing your presentation on the world's best workforce. I certainly appreciate that. I do have a question. As a rural senator, I have several districts in my district, and I've met with many of those in the last couple of months, and one of the recurring things that keeps coming up, that keeps coming up is the paperwork and the redundancy and the duplication of paperwork. And in the world's best workforce, a lot of the reporting that is done also duplicates other reports that are being sent in. So the question is when can we expect the Department of Education to eliminate some of the duplication and get down to doing reports that are necessary and not submitting reports that are duplicative? Because what we're doing by continuing to do these duplicative reports is we're taking money out of the classroom that we could be using to teach the students. And that was a real concern with many of my districts. So you can tell me kind of what the expectations are for your department as far as in your mind and what we can expect?
Yeah. Mr. Chair, Senator Doms, great question. We have been trying to get to the one plan for the past several years. This was our first step to that, so that school districts do not need to turn in anything to the department except their world's best workforce plan. So you may recall from unsession, we brought a number of reports and plans to the body to have those taken out of legislation so that we no longer need to collect them. And we will be bringing, again, a list. Those were not acted upon, but we could use your help in getting rid of mandated reports, QComp, integration, facilities, you name it. There's a plan for almost everything. And if we could get rid of the plans, a third grade literacy plan, I mean, it's not that the work isn't important for them to plan around these items, but if it's included in a comprehensive and coherent way within the world's best workforce plan, then it really shouldn't have to be a separate plan. And that's why we did World's Best Workforce, was to combine all of these plans so that your QComp coordinator and your integration coordinator and your person who's working on professional development, your person who's working on curriculum review and adoptions, they're not all sitting in different offices. They're actually talking together. And so by doing the World's Best Workforce, we are saying, let's move to one plan. But I need your help in getting rid of all the other plans that are in law.
Follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Thank
Senator
you.
Dames.
Follow-up question would be, do you feel that the reporting that's done for the world's best workforce would be sufficient then for all of the reporting you would need?
Mr. Chair, Senator Doms, absolutely, because that
Thank you.
should be your strategic planning. And underneath that, underneath every single area, it should clearly line out what it is that you're working on. And so if it's high-quality teachers, that is part of third grade literacy. It's part of your high school graduation. It's part of career readiness, that all professional development that teachers are doing for that 2% set aside or for QComp ought to be driven by your world's best workforce plan. Now, having gone back to my earlier statement saying that I believe our superintendents and our school boards are still maturing around world's best workforce planning, they would then have to take this planning seriously, have the stakeholder engagement that is required in law, and I don't feel confident that all our districts are really including teachers and including all of their principals and including a broad stakeholder group within their communities like the law requires. If they're doing those things, then absolutely it meets the letter of what they would need to, in terms for the intentionality and the deliberateness to actually get everything going on the same page and moving toward a higher student achievement.
Follow-up, Mr. Chair.
Yes, we will have more chance at another time, but we do have some people
I'll
from
just
greater
pass then.
Minnesota that are going to
We'll talk about it again. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dames.
I'd be
And
glad
if
to
we
take your
can,
questions after too, Senator Dahl.
Senator Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for sharing an update on the world's best workforce and how Minnesota is doing as we move in that direction. One of I think the heart of the world's best workforce is really the career and college readiness. That's really, I think, our goal that we want to obtain. And I know when students take the MCAs, they get a report. That report shows this is how my child or the student scored. There are 4 levels, I think exceeds expectations, meets expectations, meets some expectations, I think, and then I forget the last one. I think a lot of people in Minnesota are very familiar with a college readiness score through the ACT and taking the career and the plan and having that starting in 8th grade and follow up. My question is, do we have a correlation to the ACT career or college readiness score? And how would our parents really know that they're college ready? If they meet expectations, does that satisfy? And have we communicated that to parents? That would be my question about, some of it's terminology, but also correlation with the ACT.
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator Clausen, another really good question. As you know, we were requiring the ACT in 11th grade for all students. I think it would be good to bring that back. I still strongly believe that's a good equity measure for all kids to be able to say you are college material, and college is necessary for a high-wage, livable wage job in the future. And we were required to align our MCAs, not align them to the ACT, but to do correlation studies all the way down to 3rd grade. Now, I don't have Jennifer here, so I'm not sure where we're at in that in that correlation, but I think it's by this year that we had to have said, you know, if you're in 3rd grade and you know, you are scoring this, you are or are not on the college-ready track, according to the MCA. So I know that my team's working on that. I can get back to you to say where we're at on those correlational studies, but we were doing those studies to the ACT because we wanted to have that information available. So that work is being done. Secondly, especially Senator Bonoff, thinking about higher ed, given that colleges still require the ACT for a score, I would say, and the new Every Student Succeeds Act allows high schools to use a different measure, and they don't have to take state tests if the state chooses. They can opt out of taking a state test, but they'd have to replace it with a nationally recognized college entrance exam. If Minnesota was to go down that route, that could be quite challenging, especially given we know that underrepresented groups are not doing as well on ACT. But, Senator Bonoff, I would love to see higher ed, once we do get these correlational studies done and validated, that higher ed Minnesota institutions at MnSCU and at the University of Minnesota would accept our state level test. Why would this be important? This is important because kids can take as much time as they want on their state level test to determine their knowledge of that item, right? Whereas an ACT is a time test. My own kids who score very well on standardized tests typically that we give in Minnesota didn't do as well on the Explore when they took the Explore test. Well, because it was timed and they just didn't simply get to half the questions. So I think that, providing a different option might eliminate some of the barriers for some of our kids who have test anxiety around this measure. Not only would that be another measure to look at, it would also allow for them to look at the growth of that student all the way back to 3rd grade. So you're seeing multiple years of data from the state tests, and I think you'd be able to make a better assessment on how well that student learns and how well they would do in college if our higher ed institutions in Minnesota would accept our state level tests. Be good for a discussion.
And there will be.
And kids would try on it, right? Because they know it would work.
Senator Hoffman yields his time to Senator Bonoff.
Mr. Chair, thank you, Senator Hoffman. And Commissioner, great idea. We're actually working on a bill to do just that, and so we'll make sure and share it with you. And work out things that we have in common. So that would be great. I also just wanted to briefly comment on the visit I did with you, Commissioner, in one of the reward schools. Yes. And I want to make sure that people understand that in order for the commissioner to have visited this reward school, they had to be a Title I school. So these are not like, oh, let's just go to the places where, you know, everybody does well because everybody does well. These were reward schools, and I, too, was blown away by the environment, by I mean, you could cry listening to how much these teachers love each other and their students, and most importantly, the principal leadership in those schools sets them so far apart. And today, I don't know if members had a chance to read the Star Tribune, but there was such a disturbing article about St. Paul Public Schools, and it talked about the relationship that the teachers had to their own district as being a sense of not feeling connected and not wanting their own children to go to the schools that they were teaching in. And you just read that and thought, that can't be. I mean, there's something wrong here. And so I just have to contrast that with what you're saying happens when things are working and when teachers really are a family. And so you can't bottle that, but one of the things we can do is really look at what we can do to support having great leaders in our schools. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it was nice to join the Commissioner. Oh, thank you. I'm used to these things being live all the time. Thank you, Commissioner. It was nice to join you at Red Tail Ridge and Savage as well. And Senator Bonoff, we had a similar experience. I'd also agree that, you know, when I look at what makes that school successful, it's the principal and how she engages her staff. And one of the things she told me was her key to success was being intentional. Yeah. And it seems very simple, but something I think that gets overlooked a lot. Commissioner, I just had a couple of points on your last slide here I wanted to clarify. You talked about strong accountability to goals and that it was hard to consolidate goals, local goals, into kind of some statewide trends. So are you suggesting that we set statewide goals and push them down to the districts?
Commissioner?
Senator Uyghur, Senator Pratt, I think that there should still be local goals. I think those are really good for the schools to set because they own those and it's organic, and I think it's really important for them to set. But what I'm saying is there's always going to be a federal system of accountability. So to have a statewide goal, to have state goals and hold me and hold our department accountable for moving those goals under the world's best workforce and align the world's best workforce to our federal accountability system. And so they'd have those, and that's how we would then determine how we intervene, how we worked with schools and worked alongside the schools.
Okay, thank you.
And Commissioner, a few of the members have asked how they can get the information for their district, and you mentioned the impossibility of putting it all together with all the different units, but we want to know how our districts are doing, representing them. This is the biggest part of the state budget. Yep. These metrics are things that we supported in a bipartisan matters. Right. So for those members that, or the general public, if they want this information for a school or their district, a charter, where should they go? So,
Mr. Chair, we have the data here on this website, so you can see the regional data and the world's best workforce profiles included here. We'd also be willing to do a convening to go through the data. It's very wonky. You know, there's a lot of data in the charts, but we'd be glad to walk folks through that and make sure that you understood it so you knew kind of what school districts were being provided.
Yeah. Well, you know, perhaps it's wonky, but if you were able to tell us, are students ready for K? Are students reading proficiently? Extent that you've closed the achievement gap, college career ready, and you don't have to dig too deep. Yeah. But there's instruments that are being used, and I think if you had a summary page that could just say where we're at on each of those measures, including the state of Minnesota,
Yeah.
where we're at on that metric, and it'll guide us strategically as we enter the upcoming session.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Mr. Chair. We'll make sure that you have summaries. Now, in terms of the local goals, we can't provide that on the local goals because, again, they're all over the place. And so it's much more challenging to aggregate up that. But on the measures we've identified here, you know, we've provided that, and we can make sure that we get it to you in a way that, that would be a good format for you to understand
Well,
and see it. Yep.
yeah, thank you, Madam
Yep.
Commissioner. And to the extent it's user-friendly, when we're meeting with our local school boards and parent groups and others, they support education, obviously,
Absolutely.
but they want to know how we doing. So if any member that wants to go further into it, and I'm sure they would, as well as non-committee members, that would be much appreciated.